My son Richard stood in my living room that Tuesday morning, briefcase in hand, wearing the smile he'd perfected in law school, the kind that said he'd already won before you realized there was a game. "We're moving tomorrow, Mom," he announced, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "I've sold your beach apartment." I stayed silent for a moment, setting down my tea carefully on the ceramic coaster my late husband David had bought me 43 years ago in Portugal. The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains, casting shadows across Richard's expensive suit. "Are you sure about that?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He laughed, that confident bark he'd inherited from his father, but wielded with far less wisdom. "Of course, Mom. It's all taken care of. The closing is scheduled for next week, and I've already found you a lovely assisted living facility in Meadowbrook. You'll love it there." I just smiled, lifting my teacup again. If you've ever dealt with family real estate drama, comment below with your city. Because the apartment he sold was actually something quite different from what he imagined. The beach apartment Richard referenced sat on Sea Breeze Boulevard, Unit 7C, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlantic. At least, that's what the deed said when I'd purchased it in 1987 for $68,000. Richard had grown up spending summers there, building sandcastles while David grilled fish on our tiny balcony. But my son had stopped visiting around 2015, right after his second divorce, when his attention shifted entirely to his hedge fund and his new wife, Melissa, who thought beach vacations were pedestrian. He'd called maybe twice a year since then, always rushed, always distracted. So Richard didn't know about the renovations in 2019, the structural survey in 2021, or the quiet paperwork I'd filed in March of 2023. He certainly didn't know about the careful conversation I'd had with my attorney, Patricia Mendez, who'd been handling my affairs since David passed. Patricia had silver hair like mine and a mind like a steel trap. She'd raised her eyebrows when I'd explained my plan. "Richard, sweetheart, why don't you sit down?" I suggested, gesturing to the armchair David had reupholstered himself in 1998. The fabric was worn now, showing its age like everything else in this house, including me. I was 72 years old, and people mistook my white hair and careful movements for fragility. My son had made that mistake for the last decade. He remained standing, checking his Rolex impatiently. "I really can't stay long, Mom. I have a meeting at 11 with the buyer's attorney. They're a lovely young couple, very excited about the property. I got $745,000 for it. That's nearly 11 times what you paid. You should be thanking me." His voice carried that patronizing warmth that adult children often use when they've decided their parents can no longer manage their own lives. I took another sip of tea, Earl Grey with exactly 1 teaspoon of honey, the way I'd been drinking it since 1973. "And you've already signed the papers?" I asked, knowing the answer but wanting to hear him say it. Richard nodded enthusiastically, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "Right here. Sales agreement, transfer of deed, everything. I used the power of attorney you gave me last year when you had your hip surgery. I knew you'd been worrying about maintaining the place, so I handled it. The money will go into the trust fund I've set up for your care at Meadowbrook. They have 24-hour nursing, Mom. Activities every afternoon. Bridge on Tuesdays." He spoke as if he were describing a resort vacation rather than warehousing his mother. Outside my window, Mrs. Chen from next door was tending her roses, the same roses she'd been nurturing for 30 years. Some things required patience and attention. My son had forgotten that lesson, if he'd ever learned it. The power of attorney document he referenced had been very specific about its limitations. Richard laid the papers on my coffee table, next to the small brass lighthouse David had given me on our 15th anniversary. The lighthouse had a tiny door that opened, revealing a hidden compartment where I'd kept special things over the years. Currently, it held a folded piece of paper, but Richard wouldn't know to look there. He never noticed small details anymore. "The closing is scheduled for next Thursday at 2 p.m., he continued, pointing to the date, November 14th, 2024. The buyers are cash purchasers, no mortgage contingency. Very clean deal. I've already given notice to the building management that you'll be vacating by month's end." His finger tapped the signature line, where Richard Morrison, attorney-in-fact, was scrawled in his aggressive handwriting. Below it, there was supposed to be a notary seal. I noticed it was there, dated October 28th, 2024. My son had been thorough. I'd give him that. just not thorough enough. Would you like some coffee cake? I asked, standing slowly, using the arm of my chair for support. My hip did ache these days, especially when rain was coming. But my mind remained sharp, sharper perhaps than Richard gave me credit for. He waved his hand dismissively. I really need to go, Mom. I just wanted to let you know personally before the movers arrive tomorrow. They'll pack everything here too. Meadowbrook is fully furnished, so you'll only need personal items. Clothing, photos, that sort of thing. He was already moving toward the door, clearly considering this conversation finished. I walked to my kitchen, my slippers shuffling on the hardwood floors David and I had refinished in 1991. From the drawer beside the sink, I retrieved a manila envelope I'd placed there 3 days ago, when Richard had called to say he was stopping by to discuss something important. Patricia had prepared it for me with her characteristic precision. Inside were documents Richard really should have reviewed before signing anything. I returned to the living room, envelope in hand, and sat back down. Before you go, I said, my voice still calm, still grandmotherly, there's something you should know about that apartment. Richard paused at the door, hand on the knob, barely concealing his impatience. What's that, Mom? I opened the envelope slowly, deliberately, the way you might unwrap a gift you wanted to savor. The property you just sold for $745,000 hasn't been in my name since April 2023. His face went blank for a moment, processing. Then he laughed again, though this time it sounded more uncertain. What are you talking about? Of course it's in your name. I checked the county records myself last month. I pulled out the first document, a quitclaim deed dated April 15th, 2023, properly notarized and filed with the county clerk. It showed the transfer of the property from Margaret Ann Morrison to someone else entirely. That someone else was my granddaughter, Emma, Richard's daughter from his first marriage. Emma was 26 now, working as a marine biologist in California, studying coral reef restoration. Richard barely spoke to her anymore, hadn't since she'd sided with her mother during the divorce. He'd written her out of his life with the same cold efficiency he applied to business deals. But I hadn't written Emma out of mine. She'd been calling me every Sunday for the past decade, telling me about her research, her struggles with graduate school funding, her dreams of opening a coastal conservation center. She'd never once asked me for money, but I'd seen her GoFundMe page struggling to reach even modest goals. The beach apartment, with its perfect view of the ecosystem she loved, had given me an idea. Patricia had made it happen legally, quietly, without fanfare. The transfer had been a gift, properly documented, taxes paid, everything by the book. Richard's face had progressed through several colors now, settling on an alarming shade of crimson. You gave the apartment to Emma? His voice rose with each word. That property was supposed to be part of your estate, part of my inheritance. How could you just give away nearly $750,000? I folded my hands in my lap, the way my own mother had taught me when dealing with difficult conversations. Stay calm, stay centered, let the facts speak. It was my property to give, Richard, and Emma needed it more than you do. Your hedge fund manages what, $200 million in assets? I believe that's what you told me last Christmas. He sputtered, searching for arguments. That's not the point. You weren't thinking clearly. You just had surgery. This could be contested as undue influence or diminished capacity. His lawyer training was kicking in now, looking for angles, for weaknesses in the armor. I smiled, that patient smile I'd perfected over 7 decades of watching people underestimate me. Patricia Mendez was very careful about that possibility, I said, pulling out another document. I had a complete cognitive evaluation done by Dr. Harrison Chen at Boston Medical on April 10, 2023, 5 days before the transfer. Perfect scores on all assessments. Would you like to see the neuropsychological report? Richard's jaw clenched. I could see him calculating, running through legal scenarios in his head. And the power of attorney I signed? I asked, already knowing this was his next move. Patricia made sure it was extremely specific. You had power of attorney for healthcare decisions and for managing my checking account for monthly bills. Property transfers were explicitly excluded from your authority, Richard. It's right there in Section 3, subsection B, paragraph 2. You should have read the fine print, sweetheart. That's what you always tell your clients, isn't it? The room went very quiet then. broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock David's father had built in 1952. Richard sat down heavily, his briefcase slipping from his hands onto the floor. "So, the sale," he began, his voice hollow. "The sale isn't valid?" I pulled out another document, this one with impressive letterhead from a downtown law firm. "Emma's attorneys sent this cease and desist letter yesterday to the buyers you found. Apparently, when they learned the seller didn't actually own the property, they withdrew their offer immediately. Something about not wanting to be involved in fraudulent transactions. I believe there might also be some questions about your use of an invalid power of attorney to execute the sale. Patricia mentioned something about potential ethics complaints to the State Bar Association, though Emma's hoping it won't come to that." Richard looked at me then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. He saw a 72-year-old woman with arthritis and thinning hair, yes, but also someone who'd been paying attention, who'd been planning, who'd never stopped being capable. "The movers?" Richard asked weakly. I reached over and patted his hand, the way I used to when he was small and had scraped his knee. "I called them yesterday and canceled. I'm not going anywhere, Richard. I'm perfectly happy in this house, the house your father and I bought in 1978 for $92,000, the house where we raised you and your sister. I still drive, I still garden, I still volunteer at the library every Wednesday. Mrs. Chen checks on me daily. My friend Dorothy and I walk 2 miles every morning at the high school track. I don't need assisted living, sweetheart. What I needed was for someone to ask me what I wanted instead of deciding for me." His expensive suit seemed to hang on him differently now, as if he'd shrunk inside it. Outside, a garbage truck rumbled past, its normal Tuesday rhythm unchanged by the small revolution happening in my living room. "Does Emma even know?" Richard asked quietly. I nodded, settling back into my chair. She called me crying when Patricia told her about the transfer, said it was too much, that she couldn't accept it. I told her what I'm telling you now. It's my property to do with as I please, and I'm pleased to give it to someone who'll actually use it and appreciate it. She's already talking about using the ground floor for her conservation center. There's a marine biology program at the State University just 20 minutes away. She's applied for a teaching position there. Richard's hands were shaking slightly. I recognized the tremor. Not fear, but anger finally meeting reality, all his careful control crumbling. "I was trying to help you," he said, and for a moment he sounded like the little boy who'd once believed his father hung the moon. "I know you thought you were," I replied gently, "but help means asking what someone needs, not assuming you know better." The brass lighthouse caught a beam of sunlight, its tiny beam seeming to wink at me. Inside its hidden compartment was the original copy of my will. The real one, not the draft Richard had somehow obtained from my previous attorney's office before I'd switched to Patricia. That draft had left everything to Richard in standard probate fashion. The real will was more interesting, more carefully considered. Patricia and I had worked on it for months, thinking through every scenario, every possibility. Richard had never asked to see it, had simply assumed he knew what it contained. Assumption I'd learned over 7 decades was the enemy of wisdom. My son had built his entire career on reading the fine print in others' contracts while ignoring it in his own life. The irony wasn't lost on me, even if it was currently lost on him. The morning was progressing, and I needed to water my African violets before the afternoon heat made them wilt. "What about Meadowbrook?" Richard asked, rallying slightly. "I've already paid the first month's deposit, $5,000. I pulled out yet another document from Patricia's envelope. "I never authorized you to spend my money on that deposit, Richard. You used your own funds, which means that loss is yours to absorb. Consider it an expensive lesson in respecting boundaries." He stared at the bank statement showing his personal account, obtained legally through discovery proceedings Patricia had quietly initiated when Emma's attorneys began investigating the fraudulent sale. Everything we'd done was above board, transparent, documented. I'd learned from watching David handle his small business for 40 years. Paper trails mattered, timestamps mattered, witnesses mattered. Patricia had made sure we had all 3 in abundance. Richard's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine, finally landing on something that looked like defeat, mixed with grudging respect. It was a start, at least. Better than the condescension he'd walked in with. "Mom, he started, then stopped. Finding words seemed difficult for him suddenly, this man who argued cases for a living. I let the silence sit between us, comfortable with quiet in a way my son had never learned to be. His generation filled every gap with noise, with action, with the assumption that doing something was always better than doing nothing. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was wait, watch, and let others reveal themselves. David had taught me that while fishing off the pier behind the beach apartment. Patience caught more than aggressive casting ever did. Richard picked up his briefcase slowly, carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter something fragile. "I should go," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "You probably should. But Richard?" He paused. "You're welcome to visit Emma at the beach apartment any time. She's your daughter. She'd like to rebuild that relationship if you're interested." His throat worked, swallowing something that might have been regret. After Richard left, the house settled into its familiar rhythms. I watered my violets, purple and white blooms that David had started from cuttings in 1985. They'd survived 3 houses, 2 climate zones, and countless winters because I'd paid attention to what they needed rather than what I assumed they needed. The parallel wasn't subtle, but sometimes the most important truths weren't. I made myself lunch, a turkey sandwich with the good mustard, not the cheap kind Richard would have me eating at Meadowbrook, and called Patricia to confirm Richard had been informed. "How'd he take it?" she asked, her voice warm with concern. "About as expected," I replied, though I think reality might be sinking in. Patricia laughed. "Good. That power of attorney stunt could have cost him his law license if Emma wanted to push it. She's being merciful." Mercy was a family trait, apparently. One Richard might learn to appreciate someday. That afternoon, Emma called from California, her voice bright with excitement and anxiety mixed together. "Grandma, are you okay? Dad he didn't get angry, did he?" I settled into my favorite chair, the one positioned perfectly to watch the birds at my feeder. "He was surprised," I said diplomatically, "but he'll come around eventually. Your father's stubborn, but he's not stupid." Emma laughed, that musical sound that reminded me so much of her mother, Richard's first wife, Karen. Karen had been good for him once, before his ambition had crowded out everything else. "I got the teaching position," Emma said, "starting in January, and the university's Marine Science Department wants to partner on the Conservation Center. They're offering grant money, equipment, everything. Grandma, this is really happening." Pride swelled in my chest, warm and sustaining. This was what family wealth should do. Enable dreams, not enable control. David would have loved seeing his granddaughter's face light up with possibility. Emma continued talking, words tumbling over each other in her enthusiasm. "I've been looking at the apartment layout. The ground floor could be converted into a small aquarium and education center. We could host school groups, run workshops on ocean conservation. The upper floor would be my living space and research office. Dr. Martinez from NOAA said she'd help design the aquarium systems." I listened, adding encouraging sounds at appropriate moments, letting her vision unfold. This was what 72 years of life had taught me. Sometimes the greatest gift you could give was belief in someone's potential. Richard had forgotten that lesson somewhere between law school and his second marriage. He'd stopped believing in possibilities and started only seeing risks, liabilities, things to be managed and controlled. Emma still saw wonder in the world. The beach apartment would protect that wonder, nurture it, let it grow into something bigger than any of us. That was worth more than any amount Richard could have gotten from selling it to strangers. "When are you moving out?" I asked, though I already knew from Patricia that Emma had given notice on her California apartment. "December 15th, Emma said. "That gives me 2 weeks to settle in before the semester starts. Grandma, would you come visit? Help me set up? I know the trip's long, but—" "Of course I'll come," I interrupted. "I haven't seen the place since 2022. I want to see what you're going to do with it." The truth was, my hip made travel difficult, and airplane seats were torture devices designed by sadists. But I'd manage. Some things were worth discomfort. Emma's squeal of delight made me smile so wide my cheeks hurt. We talked for another 30 minutes, making plans, discussing paint colors and furniture arrangements. She wanted to keep some of David's old fishing gear as decoration, wanted to honor his memory in the space he'd loved. That detail alone told me I'd made the right choice in giving her the apartment. That evening, my daughter Susan called, Richard's younger sister by 3 years. I heard Richard tried to sell the beach apartment and got caught, she said without preamble. Susan had never been one for gentle approaches. She worked as an emergency room nurse and had the directness that profession required. He did indeed, I confirmed, stirring pasta sauce on the stove. Cooking for one felt strange after 50 years of cooking for David, but I'd adapted, learning to make small portions, to freeze leftovers properly. Good for you, Mom, Susan said. He's been acting like you're incompetent for years. Drives me crazy. You're sharper than most 40-year-olds I know. I smiled into the phone. Susan and I had always understood each other better than Richard and I did. Maybe because she'd chosen a profession about helping rather than controlling. He called me, Susan continued. Complained for 20 minutes about how you're making bad decisions. I told him to grow up. Outside my window, evening was settling in, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Susan's voice softened. Are you really okay, though? Not just legally, but actually okay? I know Richard can be a lot. I thought about her question seriously, stirring my sauce, watching it bubble and thicken. Was I okay? My husband was gone 5 years now. My body ached in ways it never had at 50. I sometimes forgot words mid-sentence or walked into rooms not remembering why. But I still woke every morning grateful for another day, still found joy in small things, still believed life held possibility. I'm okay, I said finally. I'm lonely sometimes, and getting old isn't for cowards, but I'm okay. I have my friends, my routines, my agency. That last one matters most, I think. Richard wanted to take that away, probably thinking he was protecting me. But protecting someone by removing their choices isn't protection. It's imprisonment dressed in good intentions. Susan was quiet for a moment. Then, you should write that down. That's profound, Mom. We talked while I ate dinner, Susan filling me in on her teenage kids' latest dramas, her husband's promotion at work, the new puppy they'd adopted against her better judgment. Normal family stuff, the daily texture of lives being lived without crisis or manipulation. After we hung up, I washed my single plate and fork, dried them, put them away in cupboards I'd organized the same way for decades. Muscle memory guided my hands through familiar motions. This house held 52 years of such motions. Washing dishes, folding laundry, sweeping floors, all the invisible labor that made a house a home. Richard had wanted to erase all that, pack it into boxes, file me away in Meadowbrook where someone else would make my meals and organize my belongings. The audacity of it still amazed me. But perhaps I'd enabled that audacity by being too accommodating over the years, too willing to let him take charge of things. David had warned me once that Richard needed boundaries, or he'd steamroll anyone in his path. The next morning, Wednesday, I kept my regular volunteer shift at the public library. I'd been shelving books and helping patrons every Wednesday for 15 years, since shortly after David's retirement. The head librarian, Marcus, was a 38-year-old man with impressive tattoos and a genuine love of connecting people with books. Mrs. Morrison, he greeted me warmly. We got those large print mysteries you requested for Mrs. Patterson. I loved this place. Loved its orderly shelves and quiet purpose. Loved helping people find stories that would transport them somewhere new. Richard had suggested I quit volunteering months ago, said it was too much stress for someone my age. As if shelving books could possibly stress anyone who'd raised 2 children and nursed a husband through cancer. I worked my shift contentedly, recommending a thriller to a young mother, helping a college student locate research materials, reading stories to the toddler group at 11. This was living. Being useful, being connected. Meadowbrook would have had crafts and bingo. No thank you. During my lunch break, I sat in the library's small staff room with my sandwich and checked my phone. Emma had texted photos of paint samples, soft blues and greens that echoed the ocean. What do you think? She'd written. I texted back my approval, suggesting the seafoam green for the education center walls. Patricia had emailed confirming that the cease and desist letter had been received by Richard's would-be buyers and they'd formally withdrawn. No lawsuit, no damage claims, just a clean break. They'd been understanding once the situation was explained, apparently. The husband worked in real estate law himself and recognized the ethical minefield Richard had wandered into. Smart people knew when to walk away from a bad situation. I wondered if Richard had learned that lesson yet, or if pride would keep him angry for months. Pride had always been his weakness, inherited from David's side of the family. The Morrisons had never been good at admitting mistakes. That evening, Dorothy came over for our weekly dinner and cards. We'd been friends since 1981, when our sons had been in the same kindergarten class. She'd helped me through David's death, and I'd helped her through her divorce 3 years ago. At 74, she was 2 years older than me, but claimed to be younger when it suited her. "So Richard tried to sell Emma's apartment?" she asked, shuffling the cards with practiced efficiency. We were playing gin rummy, a game we'd played every Wednesday for decades. I explained the situation while dealing, watching Dorothy's eyebrows climb higher with each detail. "That boy," she said finally, shaking her head. "I remember when he was 8 and tried to reorganize your kitchen because he thought his system was better. Some people never change." She wasn't wrong. Richard had always been convinced his way was the superior way, even when evidence suggested otherwise. David had tried to soften that tendency, but after his death, there'd been no one to check Richard's certainty. Dorothy won 3 hands straight while I told her about Emma's plans for the conservation center. "You did good, Margaret," she said, tallying our scores. "That apartment needed someone who'd love it, not someone who'd see it as a line item on a balance sheet. Emma will do wonderful things there." We played until 9 o'clock, when Dorothy's daughter picked her up. I waved from my porch, watching the taillights disappear down the street, then locked up for the night. My bedtime routine was sacred: wash face, brush teeth, take evening medications, set out tomorrow's clothes, read for 30 minutes. Tonight's reading was a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman who'd understood that power lay not in controlling others, but in enabling them. I marked my page at 10:30 and turned off the light, listening to the house settle around me. Somewhere across town, Richard was probably still awake, still calculating, still trying to find an angle. Let him calculate. The math wasn't in his favor. Thursday morning brought rain, the steady autumn kind that made my hip throb and my joints ache. I took my time getting up, letting my body wake slowly, accepting its limitations without letting them define me. This was aging, a negotiation between what you wanted to do and what your body allowed. I'd learned to respect that negotiation rather than fight it. Breakfast was oatmeal with walnuts and blueberries, the same meal I'd eaten most mornings for the past decade. Routine brought comfort. The morning news played in the background, talking about elections and economic forecasts and celebrity divorces. The endless churn of information that seemed increasingly irrelevant the older I got. What mattered was right here: this kitchen, this meal, this day. Emma texted that she'd found a marine biology graduate student interested in interning at the conservation center. Small pieces of her dream were clicking into place. I texted back my congratulations, then called my doctor's office to schedule my annual checkup. Just because Richard had tried to declare me incompetent didn't mean I could neglect my health. Quite the opposite, actually. Friday afternoon, Richard called. I almost didn't answer, then decided avoidance solved nothing. "Hello, Richard." His voice was careful, controlled, the tone he used when executing difficult professional conversations. "Mom, I wanted to apologize. I should have discussed the apartment situation with you first, before taking any action." It wasn't quite the apology I'd hoped for. It focused on procedure rather than assumption. But it was something. "Thank you," I said simply. "I appreciate you saying that." Silence stretched between us, awkward and unresolved. "I still think Meadowbrook would be a good option for you eventually," he continued, apparently unable to help himself. "The facility is excellent, and as you get older, having professional care available will become important." There it was again, the assumption that his judgment superseded mine. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. "When and if I need professional care, I'll make that decision with my doctor and my attorney, Richard. Not with you. That's what I need you to understand." More silence. Then, "Melissa thinks I should contest the property transfer. She says Emma manipulated you." Of course Melissa did. Richard's second wife had never met money she didn't want to control. She'd been pushing Richard to separate me from my assets since their wedding 3 years ago. I'd seen it clearly even if Richard hadn't. "Melissa is welcome to her opinion," I said, keeping my voice level. "But Patricia Mendez has documentation that would make any contest expensive and ultimately unsuccessful. The transfer was legal. I was competent. And there was no manipulation. Emma didn't even know about it until after it was finalized. Fighting this would cost you legal fees, family relationships, and possibly your law license if the Bar Association decides to investigate your use of that power of attorney. Is that really the hill you want to die on? I heard him breathing on the other end, could almost feel him wrestling with his pride, his wife's pressure, and the uncomfortable reality that his mother had outmaneuvered him. "No," he said finally. "I suppose not." "Good," I replied. "Then let's move forward. Emma would love to have you visit once she's settled in. Your daughter misses you, Richard. She's too proud to say it, but she does. This could be a chance to repair that relationship." He made a non-committal sound. Change came slowly sometimes, glacially, but it did come if you had patience. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. The weather, Susan's kids, whether I needed anything from the grocery store. Small talk that felt like a tentative peace treaty. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my lap, feeling the complicated weight of motherhood. You never stopped wanting better for your children, even when they disappointed you. Especially then. David used to say that loving your kids meant letting them fail sometimes, letting consequences teach what lectures couldn't. Maybe Richard was finally getting that education, late though it was. Only time would reveal if he'd learned anything from it. The following Tuesday, Emma sent photos of herself standing in the beach apartment, arms spread wide, face glowing with joy. The ocean sparkled behind her through those floor-to-ceiling windows I'd loved for 37 years. "I'm home," she'd captioned the image. Looking at her face, I knew with absolute certainty that I'd made the right choice. This apartment had sheltered my family's happiness for decades, summer vacations, anniversary celebrations, quiet weekends when David and I needed to escape routine. Now it would shelter Emma's dreams, would become a place where children learned to love the ocean, where marine life could be studied and protected. The apartment's purpose had evolved, just as families evolved, just as I'd evolved from young bride to widow to woman who understood her own power. Richard had wanted to cash out its financial value. I'd chosen to invest in its human value instead. Numbers on a balance sheet faded. Changed lives endured. That mathematics made sense to me in a way Richard's spreadsheets never would. Over the next several weeks, Emma sent regular updates. The aquarium systems were being installed. The university partnership was formalized. Local schools were booking field trips for the spring semester. She'd hired 2 marine biology students as part-time staff. Richard remained silent, though Susan reported he'd asked about Emma during their last phone call. Small steps. Melissa was apparently still pushing him to sue me for something. Diminished capacity, undue influence, whatever legal theory she could manufacture. Patricia assured me there was no case, but the threat hung in the background like distant thunder. I refused to let it affect my daily life. I had my routines, my friends, my Wednesday library shifts. Dorothy and I had started walking 3 miles instead of 2, building stamina slowly. Mrs. Chen taught me how to make proper dumplings, a skill I'd always wanted to learn. Life continued, rich and textured, proof that 72 wasn't an ending, but just another chapter. In mid-December, I flew to see Emma despite my hip's protests. The plane ride was indeed torture, my joints screaming by the time we landed. But Emma met me at the airport with a wheelchair she'd rented, refusing to let pride make me suffer. We drove to the beach apartment through familiar streets, past the seafood restaurant where David had proposed to me in 1972, past the miniature golf course where Richard and Susan had played as children. Memory layered over memory, time collapsing until past and present existed simultaneously. The apartment had changed, but remained essentially itself. Those windows, that view, the sound of waves that had been the soundtrack to so many family moments. Emma had painted the education center seafoam green as I'd suggested. Aquarium tanks lined one wall, their occupants, sea anemones, starfish, small fish in brilliant colors, moving in gentle currents. "It's perfect," I whispered, tears surprising me. Emma hugged me carefully, aware of my fragile bones. "It's because of you, Grandma." All of this. Emma had set up the guest bedroom beautifully, with soft sheets and extra pillows to support my aching hip. That first night, I lay in bed listening to the ocean. The same sound I'd fallen asleep to decades ago when life was different, when David was alive and our children were young and the future seemed infinite. Now the future was more finite, measured in years I could count rather than decades stretching endlessly ahead. But it was still my future, still mine to shape within the limitations age imposed. Richard had wanted to take that agency away, to make decisions for me as if I were already gone. I understood his fear. Watching parents age was terrifying, a preview of your own mortality. But fear didn't justify control. Compassion required seeing people as they actually were, not as you feared they might become. I fell asleep thinking about that distinction, about the difference between protecting and imprisoning, about love that freed versus love that constrained. The next day, Emma gave me a complete tour of the conservation center. She explained the aquarium systems with infectious enthusiasm, showing me the filtration setup, the temperature controls, the careful ecosystem she'd created. A group of third graders arrived at 10 o'clock, chaperoned by 2 teachers who looked harried but engaged. Emma transformed in front of the children, becoming animated and funny, making ocean conservation accessible to 8-year-olds. She showed them a sea star, explaining regeneration. She demonstrated how anemones caught food. She talked about coral bleaching in terms they could understand, making them care about ecosystems they'd never seen. Watching her, I saw David in her gestures, saw the teaching gift he'd had when explaining his small business to confused customers. Gifts passed through generations in unexpected ways. Richard had gotten David's drive, but not his humility. Emma had gotten his drive and his heart. The genetic lottery was an interesting thing. After the children left, Emma made us lunch. Tuna sandwiches eaten on the balcony despite December's chill. I wore David's old cardigan, the one I'd kept because it still smelled faintly of his aftershave, though that was probably my imagination by now. "Has your dad called you?" I asked carefully, not wanting to push, but curious. Emma shook her head, her expression carefully neutral. "No, but Aunt Susan said he asked about me, so that's something." She paused, watching a gull dive for fish. "I'm not holding my breath, Grandma. Dad's pride won't let him admit he was wrong. Maybe someday, but I'm not planning my life around waiting for him to show up." Her tone was sad, but resolved. The acceptance of someone who'd already done their grieving. I wanted to promise her Richard would come around, would apologize, would rebuild their relationship. But I'd learned over 7 decades that some promises couldn't be kept. People changed only when they chose to, not when others needed them to. All I could offer Emma was my own presence, imperfect and temporary though it was. We spent the afternoon organizing files in her research office, a cozy space on the upper floor with a desk positioned to overlook the ocean. Emma's dissertation notes covered one wall, charts tracking coral health, temperature data, photographs of reef systems in various states of decline or recovery. Her life's work spread before us like a map of commitment. "Dr. Martinez wants to collaborate on a longitudinal study," Emma explained, pointing to a proposal draft on her computer. 5 years tracking reef recovery using new restoration techniques. It could be groundbreaking if we can secure funding. I listened, understanding perhaps a quarter of the scientific terminology, but grasping the essential point. Emma was building something important, something that would outlast her, just as David's business had outlasted him, just as this apartment would outlast me. Legacy wasn't about money hoarded or property clung to. It was about what you enabled others to create. Richard saw wealth as something to preserve and control. I saw it as something to invest in possibility. That evening, Emma and I made dinner together in the apartment's small kitchen. She'd bought ingredients for David's famous fish stew, working from a recipe card I'd written out in 1989, stained now with decades of use. The ritual of chopping vegetables, measuring spices, stirring the pot, brought David vividly present. "Grandpa taught me to make this when I was 12, Emma said, adding tomatoes to the simmering base. "The summer before middle school. He said knowing how to cook one excellent meal was essential life knowledge." I smiled, remembering that summer, remembering Richard's annoyance that his father was wasting time teaching Emma to cook when she should be studying for accelerated math placement. David had ignored him, had spent patient hours with Emma in this very kitchen, teaching her not just cooking but attention, care, the way you showed love through service. Those lessons had taken root in ways Richard's lectures never had. Emma's conservation work was an extension of that same principle, caring for things beyond yourself, investing effort without guaranteed return. The stew was good, not quite as good as David's had been, but close enough to conjure memory. We ate on the balcony again, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching stars emerge over the Atlantic. "Thank you for this," Emma said quietly, "for trusting me with something so important to you." I reached over and squeezed her hand, her skin young and warm against my age-spotted fingers. "Thank you for being someone worthy of trust," I replied. "Your grandfather would be so proud of what you're building here. I wish he could see it." Emma's eyes glistened. "I think about that a lot. About showing him the conservation center, telling him about the research partnerships, the school programs. He'd probably have a dozen ideas for making it better." We sat in comfortable silence, both communing with David's ghost, both grateful for what he'd given us. Emma his time and attention, me 50 years of partnership. Some losses never healed completely. You just learn to carry them with grace. I stayed 4 days total, each one precious despite my hip's constant complaints. Emma drove me to the airport on Saturday morning, both of us teary at the departure gate. "Visit again soon," she insisted. "Spring break? You could help me set up the native plant garden out front." I promised I would, meaning it even as I acknowledged privately that travel was getting harder. My body was imposing new limits monthly, it seemed. But I'd manage one more trip at least, maybe 2. After that, we'd see. Life required flexibility, required accepting what you could no longer do while maximizing what remained possible. The flight home was exhausting, and Dorothy picked me up at the airport, drove me home, helped me inside. "You look worn out," she observed with characteristic bluntness. "But happy. Did the trip accomplish what you hoped?" I nodded, sinking gratefully into my familiar armchair. "Emma's going to be fine. Better than fine. The apartment is exactly where it should be." Dorothy smiled, patting my shoulder. "Then the scheming was worth it." The weeks before Christmas passed in their usual rhythm. I decorated modestly, a small tree, some garland, the nativity set David had carved during our 2nd year of marriage. Susan and her family came for dinner on Christmas Eve, filling the house with noise and laughter and the chaos of teenage grandchildren arguing about video games. Richard sent a card but declined Susan's invitation to join us, claiming he and Melissa had other plans. Melissa's family, probably, where Richard could pretend his mother hadn't embarrassed him, where he could maintain the fiction that he was the successful son managing his aging parents' affairs competently. I tried not to let his absence hurt, tried to accept that some distances couldn't be bridged by wishing. Susan hugged me extra hard when they left, understanding without words what Richard's empty chair meant. "He'll come around eventually," she whispered. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. I was learning to release expectations, to let people be who they were rather than who I needed them to be. New Year's Eve. I spent quietly with Dorothy, watching the television countdown from her couch, drinking sparkling cider because champagne gave us both headaches now. At midnight, we toasted the year ahead with cautious optimism. "To 2025, Dorothy said, clinking her glass against mine. "May it be kinder than 2024. I'd survived David's death in 2019, survived a pandemic, survived Richard's betrayal and my own hip surgery. I'd survived 7 decades of life's complications. One more year seemed manageable. January brought bitter cold and icy sidewalks that confined me mostly indoors. Dorothy and I suspended our morning walks, switching to mall walking on particularly brutal days. My hip ached constantly, and I finally conceded to using a cane more regularly. Aging was a series of small surrenders, each one requiring its own grief and acceptance. But I was still here, still autonomous, still making my own decisions. That mattered more than mobility or comfort. In late January, Patricia called with news. "Richards filed a formal complaint with the court, claiming you lacked capacity when you transferred the beach apartment to Emma. He's requesting a competency hearing." My stomach dropped, despite knowing this was always a possibility. "When?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "March 5th, Judge Williams presiding. Margaret, this is going to be intrusive and probably upsetting. He'll have to provide evidence of incompetency, which means testimony from people about your behavior, possibly medical examinations. I'm confident we'll prevail. Your cognitive assessment is bulletproof, and you've demonstrated consistent competency in managing your affairs, but it won't be pleasant. I sat down slowly, my cane clattering against the chair. Richard was really doing this, really choosing legal warfare over accepting his mother's autonomy. Pride and Melissa's influence had won out over decency. "What do I need to do?" I asked. Patricia's voice was warm with reassurance. "Just keep being yourself. Keep your routines. Document everything. I'll handle the legal strategy." The competency hearing became a dark cloud hanging over the following weeks. Susan was furious when I told her, threatened to testify against Richard if needed. Emma called crying, apologizing for being the cause of family warfare. I reassured them both that this wasn't their fault, that Richard's actions reflected his own issues, not their worth. But privately, I felt the weight of it. My own son publicly claiming I was incompetent, dragging our family dysfunction into court, spending money on attorneys to prove his mother couldn't manage her own life. The cruelty of it gutted me in quiet moments. Dorothy found me crying one Wednesday after my library shift, sat with me while I processed the betrayal. "He's scared," she said finally. "That doesn't excuse it, but fear makes people ugly. He's watching you age and can't cope, so he's trying to control what frightens him." Maybe she was right. Maybe Richard's lawsuit was grief dressed as concern. Understanding his motivation didn't make it hurt less. Patricia assembled our defense with military precision. Dr. Chen provided updated cognitive assessments showing my mental acuity remained excellent. Marcus from the library wrote a detailed letter describing my reliable volunteer work and sharp memory for patron preferences. My financial advisor documented my sound investment decisions. My doctor confirmed I managed my medications independently and made informed healthcare choices. Even Mrs. Chen, my neighbor, wrote a statement describing how I maintained my home and garden competently. Patricia created a portrait of a woman fully in command of her faculties, capable of making binding legal decisions. "Richard's going to argue that the transfer was out of character, that you'd never previously shown interest in major gifts to Emma," Patricia explained during a prep session at her office. "We'll counter that the transfer was entirely consistent with your values. Family, conservation, enabling the next generation. We'll show it was thoughtful, planned, executed properly. You're not incompetent. You're strategic." Her confidence bolstered mine, but anxiety still gnawed at my sleep. The week before the hearing, Emma flew in from California despite my protests that she shouldn't miss work. "I'm testifying," she said firmly. "He's doing this because of me. I'm not letting you face it alone." Having her in the house brought comfort and complication. She slept in her old room, now my craft space, on an air mattress we'd bought at Target. We practiced testimony with Patricia, rehearsing potential questions Richard's attorney might ask. How often did Emma visit? Did she discuss financial matters with me? Had she ever requested money or property? The questions felt invasive, reducing our relationship to a series of transactions rather than the love and shared history that actually defined it. "This is horrible," Emma said after one particularly grueling practice session. "I feel like we're on trial for caring about each other." Patricia nodded grimly. "That's exactly what competency challenges do. They pathologize normal relationships, looking for manipulation where there's just affection. But we'll get through it." March 5th arrived cold and gray, appropriately miserable. I dressed carefully in my navy suit, the one I'd worn to David's funeral, armoring myself for battle. Susan drove Emma and me to the courthouse, her jaw set with protective fury. "If Richard tries to talk to you, ignore him," she instructed. "He doesn't deserve your attention." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and formal, smelling of furniture polish and old anxiety. Richard sat on one side with his attorney, a severe woman in an expensive suit. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Melissa wasn't present, I noted. Apparently she didn't have the courage to witness her campaign's culmination. Judge Williams was a black woman in her early 60s, with intelligent eyes and an expression that suggested she'd seen too many family disputes. Patricia squeezed my hand as we sat. "Remember, just answer the questions honestly, and don't elaborate beyond what's asked." The proceedings began with procedural motions and establishing the facts. Then, Richard's attorney called her first witness, Richard himself. He took the stand looking composed but nervous, hands clasped tightly in his lap. His attorney led him through a narrative I barely recognized, a mother whose memory was failing, who forgot appointments, who made impulsive decisions, who'd become vulnerable to manipulation. "Can you describe your mother's cognitive state following her hip surgery?" the attorney asked. Richard leaned into the microphone. "She was confused frequently, mixing up medications, forgetting conversations we'd had. I was concerned enough to obtain power of attorney for her protection. Lies built on half-truths. I'd been groggy immediately after surgery, yes, but that was anesthesia, not dementia. The power of attorney had been his idea, pressured through when I was in pain and not reading carefully." Patricia made notes furiously, her expression darkening. Richard continued spinning his fiction. The transfer to Emma had surprised him, seemed out of character, worried him that someone was taking advantage of his vulnerable mother. He performed concern beautifully, almost convincing if you didn't know him. Patricia's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Morrison, when did you last visit your mother before discovering the property transfer?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure exactly. Several months, perhaps." 7 months, Patricia corrected, consulting her notes. "Your last documented visit was September 2022. In the 20 months between that visit and the property transfer in April 2023, how many phone calls did you have with your mother?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't recall the exact number. We spoke regularly." Patricia smiled thinly. "Your mother's phone records show 6 calls totaling 43 minutes during that period. Does that sound like someone closely monitoring a parent's declining cognitive state?" Richard's attorney objected to relevance. Judge Williams overruled her, clearly interested in the answer. "Mr. Morrison, you claim your mother was confused and vulnerable. Did you ever seek a medical evaluation of her cognitive state?" Richard admitted he hadn't. "Did you discuss your concerns with her physicians?" He hadn't done that either. Patricia let the silence sit, let the implications sink in. Richard claiming incompetence without any actual evidence. Patricia then called Dr. Chen, who testified to my excellent cognitive scores both before and after the property transfer. She explained the comprehensive testing she'd administered, the multiple domains assessed, the clear results showing no impairment. "In your professional opinion, was Mrs. Morrison capable of making informed decisions about property transfers in April 2023? Patricia asked. Dr. Chen was unequivocal. "Absolutely. Her cognitive function was completely within normal limits for her age. She demonstrated excellent judgment, memory, reasoning, and executive function." Richard's attorney tried to undermine this on cross-examination, suggesting the tests could have been influenced by my knowing they were scheduled. Dr. Chen demolished that argument with technical precision, explaining the test design prevented such manipulation. Next came Marcus from the library, who described my reliable volunteer work with specific examples of patrons I'd helped. Then my financial advisor, who walked through my investment portfolio decisions. Each witness painted the same picture: a competent woman managing her life thoughtfully. Richard's fiction crumbled under factual weight. When Patricia called me to testify, I walked to the stand carefully, using my cane, aware of every eye watching. I swore to tell the truth, and sat, arranging my skirt, meeting Judge Williams' gaze directly. Patricia's questions were gentle, letting me explain the transfer in my own words. I described Emma's passion for conservation, my desire to support meaningful work rather than leave wealth to someone who didn't need it. I explained the careful planning with Patricia, the cognitive assessment, the decision to gift the property while alive so I could see Emma use it. "Did anyone pressure you to make this transfer?" Patricia asked. "No," I said firmly. "It was entirely my decision, made for my own reasons, executed exactly as I intended." Richard's attorney's cross-examination was aggressive, trying to paint Emma as manipulative, suggesting I'd been confused or coerced. I remained calm, answering each question directly, never losing my composure. "Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that this transfer was out of character for you?" she pressed. I smiled slightly. "No, it was entirely in character. I've always believed family wealth should enable dreams, not sit unused in accounts." Emma testified next, her voice steady, despite visible nervousness. She explained our relationship history, the Sunday phone calls, her surprise at the transfer, her initial reluctance to accept it. Richard's attorney tried to make something sinister of Emma's financial struggles, suggesting she'd exploited my generosity. Emma didn't take the bait. "My grandmother has helped me my entire life," she said quietly. "Not with money, but with belief. The apartment was an extension of that belief. I never asked for it. I would never ask for it." Her dignity was perfect, unassailable. Susan testified about our regular contact, my sharp memory, my independent management of daily life. Mrs. Chen described my competent garden maintenance and our conversations. Patricia even called Dorothy, who described our friendship and my mental acuity with colorful detail that made Judge Williams smile. The portrait that emerged was undeniable, a woman fully capable of managing her affairs. Richard's case was built on assumption and absence, not evidence. By early afternoon, testimony concluded. Judge Williams called a recess before delivering her ruling. We waited in a small conference room, Emma holding one of my hands, Susan the other. Patricia reviewed her notes, confident but cautious. "She'll rule in our favor," Patricia said. "The evidence is overwhelming. But judges can surprise you sometimes." 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. Finally, a clerk summoned us back. Judge Williams had removed her reading glasses, was looking directly at Richard. "I've reviewed all evidence and testimony," she began. "The petitioner has failed to present credible evidence of incompetency. Multiple medical professionals have documented Mrs. Morrison's cognitive capacity. Witnesses have established her consistent pattern of independent decision-making and sound judgment. The property transfer in question was properly executed, properly documented, and falls well within Mrs. Morrison's rights as property owner. Furthermore, I'm troubled by the petitioner's apparent lack of involvement in his mother's life prior to discovering a transfer that personally disappointed him. This proceeding strikes me as less about capacity and more about control." Petition denied. Relief flooded through me so powerfully I nearly sobbed. Judge Williams wasn't finished. "Mr. Morrison, I'm referring this matter to the State Bar Association for review regarding your use of power of attorney to attempt sale of property you didn't own. That's a serious ethical concern." Richard went pale. His attorney whispered urgently to him. Judge Williams banged her gavel. "This hearing is concluded." We stood as she exited. Then I turned to Emma and Susan, letting tears finally come. Patricia hugged me carefully, mindful of my fragile bones. "It's over," she said. "You won." But it didn't feel like winning. My son had just publicly tried to declare me incompetent, and I'd had to prove my worth to a court of law. The victory was real, but Pyrrhic. Outside the courtroom, Richard approached us, his attorney gone, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Susan stepped between us protectively. "Don't even think about it," she warned. But I touched her arm gently. "It's okay." I faced my son, this man I'd raised, who'd just tried to strip away my autonomy. "Richard," I said quietly. "Mom, He started, then stopped, words failing him. Up close I could see how he'd aged. Lines around his eyes, gray threading his hair. When had that happened? "You have a choice now," I said, keeping my voice level. "You can accept this outcome and try to rebuild what you've damaged, or you can keep fighting and lose everything. Your sister's respect, your daughter's hope of reconciliation, any remaining relationship with me, and possibly your law license if the Bar Association agrees with Judge Williams. Choose wisely, Richard. You won't get another chance." He stared at me, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman I actually was rather than the declining mother he'd imagined. "I'm sorry," he whispered. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough to repair the damage he'd caused. But it was a start, maybe. "Sorry isn't sufficient," I said. "But changed behavior might be. Emma's phone number hasn't changed. Neither has mine. Call her. Visit her. See what she's built. Be her father instead of her adversary. That's how you fix this." We left him standing there in the courthouse hallway, a man confronting the consequences of his choices. Susan drove us home, muttering angrily about Richard's selfishness. Emma was quiet in the back seat, processing everything. "Do you think he will?" she asked finally. "Call me?" I turned to look at her. "I honestly don't know, sweetheart. People change or they don't. We can't control that. We can only control ourselves. That night, after Susan and Emma left, I sat in my quiet house thinking about the day. The competency hearing had been awful, invasive, a violation of dignity and privacy. But I'd survived it. More than survived. I'd prevailed. My autonomy was protected legally now, reinforced by court order. Richard couldn't try this again. And maybe, just maybe, the shock of losing so completely would jar him into self-reflection. Maybe Melissa's influence would wane. Maybe he'd remember who he'd been before ambition and pride had warped him. Or maybe not. I couldn't control Richard's choices, only my responses to them. The following weeks were quiet recovery. Emma returned to California, her conservation center thriving. She sent photos of spring programs, children learning about tide pools, local press coverage of her work. The apartment I'd given her was fulfilling exactly the purpose I'd hoped for, enabling meaningful contribution to the world. Patricia reported that the Bar Association was indeed investigating Richard's power of attorney abuse, though outcomes of such investigations took months or years. I resumed my normal routines: library Wednesdays, walks with Dorothy, bridge games, tending my garden as spring arrived. Life continued in its ordinary way, proof that the dramatic moments were ultimately just interruptions in the steady flow of daily existence. Mrs. Chen's roses bloomed spectacularly that April. I planted tomatoes in my small vegetable patch. Dorothy and I increased our walks to 4 miles. My hip ached but held. I was 73 now, having had a birthday I'd barely celebrated during the hearing stress. 73, still here, still autonomous, still capable. In late April, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, then decided to answer. "Mom?" Richard's voice, uncertain, lacking his usual confidence. "It's Richard. I'm in town. I was wondering, could I take you to dinner?" I sat down slowly, processing the request. This was what I'd asked for, wasn't it? A chance at reconciliation. But I felt nothing except tired wariness. "Why?" I asked simply. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you were right. About everything. I've been seeing a therapist. About control issues, about fear of losing you, about my relationship with Emma. I have a lot to work on. But I thought maybe dinner could be a start." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Vulnerability from Richard was so foreign, I almost didn't recognize it. I thought about what I wanted, what would serve my emotional health versus what might enable family healing. Sometimes those were different things. "Dinner is fine," I said finally. "Tomorrow evening, 6 o'clock, at Salvatore's. The Italian place near my house, public and familiar. Safe territory." Dinner was awkward. 2 people who'd been family learning to navigate new boundaries. Richard looked haggard, older than his 51 years. He asked about my garden, my volunteer work, my health. Small talk that felt like careful fence mending. Finally, over dessert, he said what he'd come to say. "I was terrified of losing you the way we lost Dad. And instead of dealing with that fear, I tried to control you. The therapist says I was attempting to manage my anxiety by managing your life. And Melissa, she was feeding those fears, suggesting you were declining when you weren't. I should have seen it. I should have trusted you." He looked directly at me. "I'm sorry, Mom. Truly sorry. I know sorry doesn't fix what I did, but I want you to know I understand how wrong I was." I studied him, looking for manipulation or performance, finding only genuine remorse. "Do you understand why I gave Emma the apartment?" I asked. Richard nodded slowly. "Because she'd use it for something meaningful. Because she needed support I've refused to give her. Because you're thinking about legacy, not just wealth preservation." "Exactly," I said. "I won't be here forever, Richard. When I'm gone, I want to know my life enabled something good, something beyond myself. Emma's conservation center is that. Your hedge fund, successful as it is, doesn't need my help." Richard winced but nodded. "I've called Emma," he said quietly. "We've talked twice. It's difficult. There's a lot of hurt. But she's willing to try, if I'm willing to change." That surprised me, gave me the first genuine hope I'd felt since this entire nightmare began. "That's good," I said. "That's really good, Richard." We finished dinner talking about safer topics. Susan's kids, his work, my upcoming garden club plant swap. Nothing resolved completely, but a foundation laid for potential repair. When he dropped me home, he walked me to my door, waited while I unlocked it. "Can I visit again?" he asked. "Maybe help with your garden." I remember Dad teaching me to stake tomatoes. I smiled, remembering those long-ago summers when Richard had been a boy who listened. "I'd like that," I said. He hugged me carefully, and I let myself lean into it briefly before pulling away. Over the following months, Richard did visit, not frequently, but regularly. He helped stake tomatoes as promised, surprising both of us with how much he'd retained from David's patient lessons. He and Emma were rebuilding slowly, cautiously, with the wariness of people who'd been hurt badly and weren't sure trust was possible. Susan reported that Richard had separated from Melissa, though whether temporarily or permanently wasn't clear. She was angry about the hearing outcome, Susan explained during one of our dinners. Wanted him to appeal, to keep fighting. When he refused, things deteriorated. I felt no satisfaction about their marital problems, just sadness at the waste of it all. Time, money, relationships damaged by pride and fear. But I was learning that you couldn't save people from their choices, could only offer support when they were ready to change. Richard was trying. That was something. Maybe not everything, but something more than I'd had 6 months ago. Emma visited again in July, bringing a marine biology colleague who wanted to study the ecosystem near the beach apartment. I flew out again in October for the Conservation Center's 1-year anniversary celebration. My body protested the travel, but witnessing Emma's joy was worth the discomfort. The anniversary event drew over 200 people: children, teachers, university faculty, local environmental groups. Emma gave a speech about conservation education, about inspiring the next generation, about her grandfather David's belief that caring for things beyond yourself was life's highest purpose. She thanked me publicly, making me cry in front of everyone. Richard attended, sitting in the back, applauding when Emma finished. Afterward, he approached her hesitantly, and they talked for 15 minutes while I watched from a distance. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language suggested something warming, softening. Later, Emma told me they'd agreed to have lunch the next day, just the two of them. "I'm not sure what we'll talk about," she admitted. "There's so much hurt, but maybe we can start somewhere." I hugged her, this remarkable young woman who'd inherited David's best qualities. "That's all any of us can do," I said. "Start somewhere and see what grows." Some plants flourished with minimal care. Others required careful tending. You did your best and accepted the results. By Christmas 2025, family dynamics had shifted subtly but significantly. Susan hosted dinner, and Richard attended with Emma, without Melissa. Their divorce was proceeding, apparently, though Richard didn't discuss it much. Emma and Richard still navigated their relationship carefully, but they were navigating, which was more than they'd done in years. Susan's teenagers were loud and delightful, filling the house with energy. I sat in Susan's comfortable living room, surrounded by my imperfect family, thinking about David. He would have loved seeing this. Emma thriving, Richard trying, our family slowly healing. Nothing was perfect. Richard and I would never have the relationship we'd once had. Too much had broken. But we had something new, built on honesty and boundaries and mutual respect earned through conflict. Maybe that was actually stronger than what we'd lost. At 73, I was learning that relationships evolved, died, and sometimes regenerated in new forms. The key was remaining open to possibility while protecting your essential self. My autonomy had been tested and affirmed. That victory mattered more than sentiment. As the year turned and 2026 arrived, I found myself reflecting on the journey from Richard's announcement in my living room to this present moment. The beach apartment that he'd tried to sell was living its best life now, serving purposes neither David nor I could have imagined when we'd first bought it in 1987. Emma's Conservation Center had educated over 3,000 children in its first year. The research partnerships were producing published papers. The local community had embraced it as a valuable resource. All of this had been possible because I'd insisted on my right to make decisions about my own property, about my own life, about what mattered to me. If I'd been in Meadowbrook as Richard had planned, the apartment would belong to strangers now, converted to just another beach rental generating income, but not meaning. Instead, it was a classroom, a research station, a monument to the idea that family legacy should enable growth, not enforce control. That distinction had defined my final years, had shaped how I wanted to be remembered, not as someone who'd hoarded wealth, but as someone who'd invested it wisely in human potential. My health continued its gradual decline, as health does at 73. New aches appeared, old ones intensified. I hired help for heavy housework, conceding some independence to preserve what mattered most. Dorothy and I still walked, though shorter distances now. My library volunteering reduced to twice monthly, then to occasional special events when I had energy. Marcus was understanding, grateful for whatever time I could offer. Life was teaching me the art of graceful withdrawal, of accepting limitations without surrendering joy. I still loved my morning tea, Mrs. Chen's garden, afternoon light through my kitchen window. Small pleasures sustained me more than grand ones ever had. Richard's visits continued, tentative but genuine. He was learning to ask rather than assume, to listen rather than direct. Progress was glacial but real. Emma called every Sunday still, updating me on center developments, on her reconciliation with Richard, on her own life unfolding. These connections, maintained and nurtured, were my real wealth. Bank accounts mattered less than love freely given and reciprocated. In spring, Patricia and I updated my will one final time, ensuring every detail reflected my current wishes. The house would go to Susan, who'd always loved it. Various accounts were divided thoughtfully between Susan, Richard, and Emma, with specific bequests to institutions that mattered to me. The library, the local women's shelter, a marine conservation fund in David's name. Richard would inherit wealth, but not control over others' shares. Emma was already thriving with the apartment. Susan would manage what remained of my estate with her characteristic practical wisdom. I'd done what I could to shape outcomes, to extend my values beyond my life. The rest would unfold as it would, beyond my influence, beyond my control. Accepting that limitation was perhaps the deepest wisdom age had granted me. You did your best, loved fiercely, protected what mattered, then released your grip and trusted the future to those who'd inherit it. My grip was loosening naturally, day by day, as it should. I was ready for whatever came next. Not eager, but ready. There was a difference. The beach apartment Richard had tried to sell represented everything I'd learned about power, agency, and legacy in my 73 years. It stood as evidence that competency wasn't measured by age, but by judgment, that wisdom could exist alongside physical decline, that knowing when to give away wealth was as important as accumulating it. The apartment was Emma's now legally and spiritually, serving purposes that transcended any sales price Richard might have obtained. Every child who learned about ocean ecosystems there, every research project it enabled, every moment of Emma's joy as she pursued her calling, these were returns on investment that no financial calculation could capture. This was the wealth that mattered, the only kind that truly endured. When my time came, whether soon or later, I'd leave knowing I'd wielded my agency well, had protected my autonomy fiercely, had invested my resources in human flourishing rather than human control. That accounting satisfied me in ways Richard's spreadsheets never could. The apartment he'd sold wasn't his to sell. It never had been, even before the legal transfer. It belonged to possibility, to dreams, to the future. I'd simply made that reality official.